November 8, 1944. The Vosges Mountains of eastern France stood blanketed in early snow, their slopes crawling with soldiers from both sides, locked in a brutal push through dense pine forests. At an observation post overlooking a narrow valley, a young soldier from Georgia adjusted his rifle scope with hands that moved with the precision of a watchmaker, despite the bitter cold that had other men fumbling with numb fingers. His commanding officer had told him just 6 months earlier that his eyes were not good enough for this work. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What that officer could not have imagined was that this supposedly inadequate soldier would go on to become one of the most effective marksmen the American forces would field in the entire European theater, changing the calculus of engagement in ways that would ripple through tactical doctrine for decades to come. His name was James Thornton, though the men in his unit called him Jimmy, and his story begins not in the forests of France, but in the red clay country outside Augusta, Georgia, where he had grown up hunting rabbits and squirrels to help feed his family of 7. The irony that would define his military career started taking shape in the spring of 1943, when at age 22 he presented himself at the recruitment office in downtown Augusta, determined to join the fight against tyranny overseas. The recruiting sergeant, a heavy-set man named Patterson who had served in the previous great conflict, looked over Thornton's paperwork with the practiced eye of someone who had processed hundreds of young men through that office. Thornton passed every test they gave him. His physical conditioning was exceptional, a product of years working his father's small farm and countless hours spent walking the pine forests near his home. His written examinations showed an education that, while limited by the segregated school system of the rural South, demonstrated sharp analytical thinking and the ability to follow complex instructions. Everything proceeded smoothly until the vision examination. The medical officer, a lieutenant named Markson, had Thornton read the standard eye chart from 20 feet away. Thornton read the top 5 lines without hesitation, his voice clear and confident. Then Markson had him read smaller and smaller letters, and here something unexpected happened. On the 6th line, Thornton hesitated. He squinted, leaned forward slightly, and read the letters slowly, missing 2 out of 7. On the 7th line, he could only make out 3 letters with certainty. Markson made notes on his clipboard, his face showing the neutral expression of a professional recording data. He had Thornton repeat the test with each eye separately, then together again. The results were consistent. Thornton's distance vision, while not terrible, fell below the standards required for regular infantry service and significantly below the standards for any specialized role requiring precise visual acuity. Markson delivered the news matter-of-factly. Thornton could serve in a support capacity, but roles requiring sharp distance vision were not recommended. What Markson could not measure with his eye chart was something Thornton had known about himself since childhood. In the woods around his home, tracking game through dense underbrush and shadow, Thornton possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect movement and distinguish patterns that other hunters missed entirely. His cousin Robert, who had hunted with him since they were boys, he used to joke that Jimmy could spot a squirrel's eye blinking from 100 yards away, even if he could not quite read a street sign at that distance. It was not about sharpness of vision in the conventional sense, but about something else entirely, something to do with how his brain processed visual information, how he could hold his focus on a specific field of view and detect the slightest deviation from the expected pattern. None of this mattered to the military bureaucracy. The rules were clear, and Thornton's scores were what they were. He was assigned to the 924th Quartermaster Company, a segregated logistics unit responsible for supply operations. The official designation meant he would spend the duration driving trucks, loading supplies, and performing the unglamorous but essential work that kept armies functioning. For most men, this would have been the end of the story, another tale of potential never realized, of circumstances and regulations conspiring to prevent someone from showing what they could truly do. But Thornton was not most men. He accepted his assignment without complaint, understanding that protest would accomplish nothing and that the war effort needed logistical support as much as it needed frontline combat troops. Yet he also recognized that circumstances in war could be fluid, that opportunities might arise for those prepared to seize them, and that the official role assigned to a soldier in a quiet office stateside might bear little resemblance to what that soldier actually ended up doing once the chaos of combat operations began. The 924th shipped out to England in January 1944, arriving in Liverpool on a cold, grey morning that reminded Thornton of winter days in Georgia, minus the pine forests. The unit spent the next 5 months in England, participating in the massive logistical preparation for the invasion of France. Thornton drove supply trucks, maintained vehicles, and learned the intricate system by which millions of tons of equipment and supplies were catalogued, stored, and distributed to support the coming offensive. He also spent every spare moment at the firing range. The base where his unit was stationed had facilities for soldiers to maintain their basic marksmanship skills, and Thornton became a familiar figure there, arriving early in the morning before his shifts and staying late into the evening. The range sergeant, a grizzled veteran named O'Brien, who had seen action in North Africa, noticed the young soldier's dedication and, more importantly, his unusual approach to shooting. Most soldiers at the range were simply maintaining basic proficiency, firing at standard targets from standard distances in standard positions. Thornton did something different. He would study a target area for long periods before firing, sometimes 5 or 10 minutes just watching. Then he would take his shots, usually in rapid succession, each one placed with careful deliberation. O'Brien, curious about this methodical approach, began watching more closely. One afternoon in late April, O'Brien approached Thornton after a particularly impressive string of shots. The young soldier had placed 15 rounds into the center mass of a target at 300 yards, using a standard-issue rifle with iron sights from a supported prone position. It was good shooting by any measure, but what had caught O'Brien's attention was Thornton's preparation time and the way he seemed to enter a state of complete focus before engaging the target. O'Brien asked Thornton about his background, and the young soldier explained his childhood in Georgia, the hunting, the way he had learned to see the woods. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had been classified as having inadequate distance vision during his initial medical screening. O'Brien, who had trained thousands of soldiers over the years, immediately understood that the military had made a mistake. What they had measured was conventional visual acuity, the ability to distinguish static letters on a chart. What Thornton possessed was something different and far more valuable for certain types of combat operations: the ability to detect movement, to distinguish camouflage from natural background, to maintain sustained focus on a field of observation and notice when something changed. O'Brien, who was coming to the end of his military career and had little to lose by bending regulations, began working with Thornton informally. He requisitioned a scoped rifle, one of the relatively few available on the base, claiming it was needed for training exercises. He gave Thornton specialized instruction in the fundamentals of precision shooting, concepts that went beyond basic marksmanship into the realm of advanced fieldcraft. They worked on estimating range by visual cues, on reading wind from vegetation movement, on the mathematics of trajectory compensation. More importantly, O'Brien taught Thornton to trust his unusual visual processing ability. Where conventional sharpshooter training emphasized acquiring and engaging targets quickly, O'Brien encouraged Thornton to use his patient, observational approach. They developed techniques for Thornton to scan areas methodically, dividing fields of view into sectors and watching each one in sequence, allowing his innate pattern recognition ability to flag anomalies that deserved closer attention. The training sessions became increasingly sophisticated. O'Brien would place objects at various distances in the wooded areas around the range, some obvious and some carefully concealed, and have Thornton locate them through patient observation. He taught Thornton to look for secondary indicators of human presence: disturbed vegetation, unnatural color patterns, geometric shapes that stood out against organic backgrounds. They practiced in different weather conditions, at different times of day, learning how light and shadow affected visibility and how to compensate for these variations. One exercise that proved particularly valuable involved having Thornton observe a section of forest for an extended period, then having other soldiers move through that section, attempting to remain concealed. Thornton would identify their positions and movements, and afterward they would discuss what had given them away. A patch of uniform color against natural browns and greens, movement that was too regular or purposeful, shadows that fell inconsistently with the surrounding terrain. These exercises refined Thornton's already considerable natural abilities into systematic techniques he could apply deliberately. O'Brien also introduced Thornton to the mental discipline required for extended observation. He explained that most soldiers, when scanning an area, would lose focus after a few minutes, their attention wandering or their eyes becoming tired. Thornton learned to divide observation into manageable segments, to systematically scan small sectors, rather than trying to watch everything at once, to give his eyes periodic rest while maintaining overall vigilance. These techniques would prove invaluable in actual combat operations, where observation might need to continue for hours. By the time the 924th moved to France in late July, following the massive invasion operation that had begun in June, Thornton had transformed himself into something the military had not intended to create. A highly skilled marksman with unconventional methods and exceptional results, still officially assigned to a logistics unit and still carrying the classification of inadequate distance vision in his service record. The unit established operations in Normandy, supporting the Allied advance inland from the beachhead. For several weeks, Thornton performed his assigned duties, driving supply runs between depots and forward positions, occasionally close enough to the front to hear artillery fire in the distance. The work was important but routine, and nothing in those weeks suggested that his situation was about to change dramatically. The shift came in early September, as Allied forces pushed eastward toward the German border. The 924th found itself attached to a combat division whose supply lines had become dangerously extended. The unit was positioned in a small French town that changed hands twice in 3 days, as both sides struggled for control of a strategic crossroads. During the second exchange of control, when German forces briefly retook the town, Thornton's supply depot came under small arms fire from a distant tree line. The attack was not particularly heavy, more harassment than a serious assault, but it was effective enough to halt all supply operations and pin down the logistics personnel in whatever cover they could find. The company commander, Captain Mitchell, a pragmatic officer who cared more about solving problems than following protocol, shouted for anyone with combat infantry experience to return fire and suppress the enemy position. Several soldiers who had transferred from combat units began engaging the tree line with rifles, but the range was significant, somewhere between 400 and 500 yards, and their fire was largely ineffective. Thornton, crouched behind an overturned supply crate, watched the tree line with the same patient attention he had given to countless targets on the range in England. He saw what the others were shooting at, the vague suggestions of movement among the trees, the occasional muzzle flash that betrayed a firing position. He also saw something else, something that his unusual visual processing ability allowed him to detect, a pattern in the movements, a rhythm to when and where the enemy soldiers exposed themselves to fire. Without waiting for orders, acting on instinct developed through months of practice, Thornton retrieved a scoped rifle from a supply crate, where O'Brien had hidden it before the unit shipped out from England. He found a stable position behind a thick wooden post, adjusted the scope to account for the distance and the light wind coming from the west, and began his methodical process of observation. For nearly 3 minutes, he simply watched, his eye pressed to the scope, scanning the tree line in systematic sectors. Other soldiers around him were firing sporadically, their shots cracking out and hitting trees or dirt with no visible effect. Thornton ignored them, maintaining his focus, waiting for his moment. Then he saw it. A soldier in German uniform shifting position behind a fallen log, the movement brief, but distinct. Thornton tracked the spot where the soldier had been, waited 5 seconds, and when the figure rose slightly to fire again, Thornton squeezed his trigger in the middle of an exhale, just as O'Brien had taught him. The German soldier dropped immediately and did not rise again. Thornton worked the bolt action smoothly, chambered another round, and returned to his systematic scan. 2 minutes later, he identified another firing position and engaged with the same result. Then another. By the time the German forces withdrew 15 minutes later, Thornton had fired 7 shots and achieved 7 clear results. The harassment fire that had pinned down the supply depot ceased entirely. Captain Mitchell, who had watched the last 3 engagements through binoculars, approached Thornton as the young soldier was cleaning his rifle. Mitchell, a veteran of combat operations in North Africa, before being transferred to Logistics Command due to a leg injury, understood exactly what he had witnessed. This was not lucky shooting or random success. This was the work of someone with genuine skill operating at an exceptionally high level. Mitchell asked Thornton about his background, his training, his official designation. When he learned about the vision classification and the informal training with O'Brien in England, Mitchell made a decision that would alter the course of Thornton's war and, in small but significant ways, influence tactical thinking about specialized marksmanship for years to come. He wrote a report to division headquarters requesting that Thornton be temporarily assigned to forward observation and counter-sharpshooter duties attached to combat infantry units operating in areas where German forces were using concealed positions to harass Allied supply lines. The request worked its way up the command chain and landed on the desk of Colonel Anderson, the division operations officer. Anderson, a professional soldier who had served in various capacities since the 1920s, was initially skeptical. The military had procedures for identifying and training specialized marksmen, and those procedures specifically screened out soldiers with vision classifications like Thornton's. But Anderson was also a pragmatist who understood that war creates its own demands, and that rigid adherence to peacetime regulations can sometimes prevent effective responses to battlefield conditions. Anderson authorized a trial period. Thornton would be attached to infantry companies on a temporary basis, with his performance carefully documented. If he proved effective, the arrangement would continue. If not, he would return to his logistics duties with no harm to his service record. It was a reasonable compromise, one that satisfied both military protocol and practical necessity. The trial period began in late September, as Allied forces fought their way through the difficult terrain of eastern France. Thornton was attached to a rifle company from the 3rd Infantry Division, operating in an area where German forces had established numerous concealed firing positions in wooded hills overlooking key roads. Allied patrols were taking regular casualties from long-range fire, and conventional responses were proving ineffective. Artillery fire was too imprecise given the dispersed nature of the enemy positions, and direct infantry assaults were costly and time-consuming. Thornton's approach was different. He would accompany patrols to areas where enemy fire had been reported, then spend hours observing, watching for the subtle patterns that revealed concealed positions. His method was methodical to the point of appearing inactive to observers who did not understand what he was doing. He might watch a hillside for 3 hours before firing a single shot, but when he did fire, the result was nearly always successful. The infantry soldiers he worked with were initially puzzled by his methods. They were accustomed to the aggressive, rapid-fire approach of conventional combat, where speed and volume of fire often mattered more than precision. Thornton's patient observation seemed almost passive by comparison, but after they saw the results, witnessed enemy positions going silent after Thornton engaged them, they began to understand and appreciate his unique approach. One particular engagement helped establish the value of his methods among the men he served alongside. A platoon had been attempting to advance along a road that passed through a narrow valley, but they were repeatedly forced back by fire from concealed positions on the surrounding slopes. The enemy soldiers were well hidden, using the natural terrain and vegetation for cover, exposing themselves only briefly to fire before moving to different positions. Conventional tactics were proving ineffective because by the time infantry could identify and engage a position, the enemy had already relocated. Thornton accompanied the next attempt to advance through the valley. Rather than moving with the main body of the platoon, he positioned himself at the entrance to the valley with a clear view of the slopes. As the platoon began their advance, enemy fire commenced from multiple positions. Thornton did not immediately return fire. Instead, he watched, observing the pattern of attacks, noting where shots came from and in what sequence. He realized the enemy soldiers were using a systematic rotation, firing from one position, then moving to another in a predictable cycle designed to make targeting difficult. Once he understood the pattern, Thornton began engaging positions not where fire was currently coming from, but where he calculated the enemy soldiers would move to next. The technique was devastatingly effective. Over the course of 30 minutes, he neutralized 4 separate positions by anticipating movement rather than reacting to it. The enemy fire diminished dramatically, and the platoon was able to advance through the valley with only light resistance. Word of this engagement spread quickly through the division. Infantry officers began specifically requesting Thornton's support for operations in difficult terrain where concealed enemy positions were expected. His reputation grew not just for his accuracy, which was exceptional, but for his ability to read tactical situations and adapt his approach accordingly. He was not simply a skilled marksman, but a tactical asset who could significantly influence the outcome of operations. One incident in particular established Thornton's reputation among the men he served with. A platoon had been pinned down in a small village by fire from a church bell tower, roughly 600 yards away. The enemy position was well chosen, offering excellent fields of observation and fire, while being difficult to approach or suppress. Several attempts to advance had resulted in casualties, and the platoon leader was considering calling for artillery support, which would likely destroy the historic church, but seemed the only viable option. Thornton, who had been moving with a different platoon nearby, heard about the situation and volunteered to attempt an alternative approach. He positioned himself in the upper floor of a barn that offered a partial view of the church tower and began his observation. For 2 hours he watched, while the pinned platoon waited and the afternoon light slowly changed. Other soldiers in the barn grew restless, suggesting that artillery was the only solution, that Thornton was wasting time. But Thornton understood something about observation that many soldiers did not, that patience was often more valuable than speed, that waiting for the right moment could be more effective than taking hasty action. He watched the tower, noting how shadows moved across the opening, how the light changed as the sun progressed across the sky, looking for any indication of where in the tower the enemy soldier was positioned. He saw brief movements, shadows that might or might not be significant, hints of presence that were too subtle for most observers to detect. Then, in the late afternoon, as shadows lengthened and the light took on the golden quality of approaching evening, Thornton saw what he had been waiting for, a brief silhouette in the bell tower opening, just a momentary shadow that most observers would never have noticed. The angle of the late afternoon sun had created a condition where the interior of the tower was momentarily illuminated in a way that revealed the position of the soldier within. Thornton had been waiting specifically for this kind of moment, understanding that changing light conditions could reveal what remained hidden at other times. He fired once. The harassment fire from the tower ceased immediately and did not resume. A patrol that reached the tower 30 minutes later found a single German soldier, defeated by a shot that had traveled 640 yards to find its mark with devastating precision. The platoon leader, who had been preparing to call in artillery that would have destroyed the church and likely caused civilian casualties in surrounding buildings, was profoundly grateful for Thornton's intervention. The church, a structure dating back to the 12th century, was preserved, and the tactical objective was achieved without the collateral damage that artillery would have caused. News of incidents like this spread through the division, and Thornton began receiving requests from multiple units for his services. Division headquarters, recognizing the unusual value he provided, formalized his assignment and began using him specifically for counter-sharpshooter operations and high-value target engagement. His official designation remained unchanged for a time. His service record still carried the notation about inadequate distance vision, but his actual role had evolved into something the military bureaucracy had never intended to create. The bureaucratic disconnect between Thornton's official status and his actual duties created some unusual situations. Supply requisitions for specialized equipment had to be justified in creative ways, since his paperwork said he was a quartermaster, not a designated marksman. When he needed ammunition for practice or operations, the requests had to be routed through informal channels, since official channels would question why a logistics soldier needed such quantities. Mitchell and other officers who supported Thornton became adept at working around these obstacles. but the situation highlighted the sometimes absurd rigidity of military bureaucracy. By early November, as Allied forces pushed into the Vosges Mountains, Thornton had been credited with neutralizing more than 60 enemy positions. The actual number was certainly higher, but military record-keeping in fluid combat situations was imprecise, and Thornton himself kept no count. He was focused entirely on the work, on perfecting his methods, on understanding how to use his unique abilities most effectively. The Vosges campaign presented new challenges. The terrain was rugged, heavily forested, and offered countless positions for concealed enemy forces to slow the Allied advance. Weather conditions were deteriorating as winter approached, with frequent rain and early snow making observation difficult. German forces, fighting on familiar ground and executing a deliberate withdrawal, were inflicting steady casualties on advancing American units. The mountain terrain required adaptations to Thornton's methods. In the relatively open country of the earlier campaigns, he could often find elevated positions that offered clear fields of observation. In the mountains, such positions were harder to establish, and the dense forests limited sightlines. Thornton learned to work in these constrained conditions, finding angles through the trees, using natural gaps in vegetation, sometimes moving multiple times to establish different perspectives on an area of interest. The weather presented additional challenges. Rain and snow reduced visibility and affected the flight of projectiles. Thornton had to account for how moisture in the air altered trajectory, how wind moving through mountain valleys created complex patterns that required constant adjustment. He learned to read weather conditions as carefully as he read terrain, understanding how a shift in temperature or humidity might affect his calculations. One particular engagement in mid-November demonstrated both the difficulty of the mountain terrain and Thornton's adaptation to it. A battalion was preparing to advance through a narrow valley that intelligence reports suggested was heavily watched by enemy observers on the surrounding ridges. The battalion commander, concerned about casualties from long-range fire during the advance, requested that Thornton conduct a preliminary reconnaissance of the ridges to identify and neutralize enemy observation positions. Thornton spent 2 days preparing for the operation. He studied maps of the area, consulted with scouts who had operated in the vicinity, and personally reconnoitered the valley approaches to identify positions that would offer him the best fields of view. The maps showed the general topography, but could not convey the actual complexity of the terrain, the density of the forests, the steepness of the slopes, the numerous small ravines and rock formations that could conceal enemy positions. He decided to approach the observation task systematically, dividing the ridges into sectors and planning to examine each sector in sequence from different positions in the valley. This would take time, potentially several days, but Thornton understood that thorough preparation was more valuable than hasty execution. The battalion commander, who had learned to trust Thornton's judgment, agreed to delay the main advance until the reconnaissance was complete. Starting before dawn on the morning of the planned reconnaissance, Thornton moved to his first observation position. He had chosen a spot that offered a view of the eastern ridge through a natural gap in the valley forest. The position was uncomfortable, requiring him to lie on cold, wet ground behind a fallen log, but it provided the sightline he needed. He settled in and began his systematic observation. The eastern ridge, covered in dense pine forest with occasional rocky outcroppings, stretched for nearly a mile. Thornton divided it mentally into sectors, each covering roughly 50 yards of frontage. He would watch each sector for 15 to 20 minutes, looking for the subtle signs of human presence: disturbed vegetation, unnatural color variations, regular geometric shapes that stood out against the irregular patterns of nature. It was painstaking work, requiring intense concentration and extraordinary patience. By mid-morning he had identified 3 positions. The first was betrayed by a patch of ground where the frost pattern was slightly different from the surrounding area, suggesting recent disturbance. The second showed itself through a gap in vegetation that formed too straight a line to be natural, indicating someone had cut or pushed aside branches to create a field of fire. The third revealed itself through shadow patterns that were inconsistent with the surrounding terrain, suggesting an artificial structure or covering. Thornton engaged each position in sequence, firing single shots from his concealed location. After each shot, he immediately relocated, moving 50 to 100 yards before settling into a new observation position. This was standard procedure, taught by O'Brien. Never fire twice from the same position, never give an enemy the opportunity to locate you through multiple shots from a single spot. It made the work slower and more physically demanding, but it also kept Thornton safe from counterfire. The results were immediate and conclusive. Each shot found its mark, and the enemy observation network on that section of ridge was effectively neutralized. Thornton continued his methodical work through the afternoon, moving to different positions in the valley to examine other sections of the ridges. By evening, he had identified and engaged 7 enemy positions, systematically dismantling the observation network that would have made the battalion's advance extremely costly. The battalion advanced through the valley the following day and encountered minimal resistance. The operation, which commanders had expected to be difficult and potentially costly, proceeded smoothly. The battalion commander, in his after-action report, has specifically credited Thornton's preliminary reconnaissance with enabling the successful advance. He noted that the casualties avoided through this approach far exceeded what would have been achieved through conventional methods like artillery bombardment or frontal assault. Such reports accumulated throughout November and into December. Division staff began studying Thornton's methods, trying to understand how to replicate his success with other soldiers. They brought in training officers to observe him in action, hoping to develop a formal doctrine that could be taught. What they discovered was that while his techniques could be described and certain elements could be taught, his fundamental ability, the unusual way his brain processed visual information and detected patterns, could not be easily transferred to others. The training officers documented Thornton's systematic approach, the division of observation areas into manageable sectors, the methodical scanning patterns, the attention to secondary indicators like vegetation disturbance and shadow anomalies. They created training materials based on these techniques and attempted to teach them to other soldiers. Some soldiers showed improvement, learning to be more patient and systematic in their observation, but none demonstrated quite the same combination of capabilities that made Thornton so exceptionally effective. The vision testing question received particular attention during these studies. Medical officers examined Thornton again, trying to understand how someone with below-standard conventional acuity could perform at such a high level in tasks requiring visual precision. What they found was that Thornton's visual system was optimized differently than the standard model. His ability to detect motion and distinguish patterns was far above average, compensating for his slightly below-average static acuity. In many ways, his visual system was better suited to the dynamic conditions of combat observation than the visual systems of soldiers with higher conventional acuity scores. This insight led to discussions about revising vision testing procedures, but bureaucratic resistance was strong. The existing tests were standardized, well-established, and relatively simple to administer. Developing new tests that could assess the full range of visual processing capabilities would be complex and time-consuming. Some officers argued for change, citing Thornton's case as evidence of the current system's limitations. Others argued for maintaining existing procedures, noting that Thornton represented a statistical outlier and that changing entire systems based on exceptional cases was not sound policy. The debate continued without immediate resolution, but Thornton's case at least established that the question was worth discussing. Before his service, the relationship between different types of visual processing and combat effectiveness had not been seriously studied. His success forced military medical and training